Rachel Thompson, a loving wife and mother, thought she had the perfect family. But when she hired Emily, a charming young babysitter, her world would quickly unravel in the most unimaginable way. Behind closed doors, a dangerous affair was brewing between Emily and Rachel's husband, Mark, setting the stage for a betrayal so dark it would lead to murder. What started as a secret relationship soon spiraled into a deadly plot that no one saw coming. The shocking truth would leave everyone questioning how well they truly knew those closest to them. The Thompson family lived in the kind of suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other, and life seemed to move at a steady, predictable pace. Their home was a 2-story house with a manicured lawn, nestled between 2 tall oak trees that framed the property like sentinels. It was the kind of place where children played outside until the sun set, and parents often gathered for casual weekend barbecues. Mark Thompson, a successful real estate agent, was well known and respected in the community. His achievements in the industry had brought financial stability, allowing him to provide a comfortable life for his family. His wife, Rachel, was a kind-hearted school teacher, known for her dedication to her students and her nurturing nature. The couple had 2 children. Together they appeared to have the perfect life, a model family in every sense of the word. Rachel and Mark had met years earlier during college, and their connection had always been strong. They shared a love of travel, hiking, and spending quality time together. Their marriage was built on mutual respect and admiration, and to those who knew them, it seemed like they had everything figured out. Mark's career was flourishing, and Rachel's work as a teacher was fulfilling. Their children were thriving in school and daycare, and their social calendar was always filled with dinner parties and family outings. On the surface, they were living the American dream. But like many seemingly perfect families, things weren't always as they appeared. Beneath the polished exterior of their life, Rachel began to sense a subtle shift in Mark's behavior. He had always been a hard worker, but lately he had been spending more time at the office, coming home late and being distant. At first, Rachel brushed it off, chalking it up to the demands of his growing career. But as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She tried to talk to him about it, but Mark reassured her that everything was fine. Still, Rachel couldn't help but notice the long hours he was keeping and the strain in their interactions. Despite these growing concerns, Rachel remained focused on her role as a mother and wife. She was determined to keep their family life as stable and happy as possible, even as her gut told her that things weren't quite as they seemed. Little did she know, the changes in Mark's behavior were part of a much bigger story, one that would soon shatter the peaceful life they had worked so hard to build. It was Rachel's decision to hire a babysitter that first began to change the course of their lives. As the demands of her teaching career grew more intense and Mark's work schedule stretched longer, she found herself juggling too many responsibilities. It wasn't easy to balance her professional life with caring for 2 young children, and Mark's increasing absence made it all the more difficult. So, she reluctantly decided to hire someone who could help. The thought of leaving her children with someone else was unsettling, but she knew it was necessary. Enter Emily Clark. She was a 22-year-old college student with an easy smile and a warm personality. Rachel first met her through a mutual friend who had spoken highly of Emily's babysitting skills. The young woman had been described as responsible and trustworthy, someone who could connect with children and keep them entertained and safe. Emily's cheerful demeanor immediately put Rachel at ease. She had been looking for a job that allowed her to make some extra money while pursuing her studies, and the Thompsons' offer seemed like the perfect fit. Emily quickly established herself as a reliable presence in their home, and Rachel was relieved to see that both Ethan and Sophie took to her immediately. In the beginning, things seemed to go smoothly. Emily would come over a few afternoons a week, helping Rachel out with the children while she prepared dinner or ran errands. She was engaging and kind with the kids, always coming up with creative games and activities to keep them entertained. Mark, too, seemed to warm to her. He would often chat with Emily while she was watching the children, talking about work and the latest happenings in town. Rachel appreciated how well Emily got along with her family, and for a time, everything seemed perfectly normal. However, as time passed, small changes began to creep in. Rachel noticed that Emily and Mark were spending more time together, particularly when Rachel wasn't around. Their conversations, which once had been light and casual, seemed to carry an undercurrent of familiarity, something more personal than a simple employer-employee dynamic. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it didn't escape Rachel's notice. She didn't think much of it at first, dismissing it as her own overactive imagination. After all, Emily was just a babysitter, someone she trusted with her children. What could possibly go wrong? But as the days turned into weeks, Rachel began to feel an unsettling shift. Mark, who had always been attentive and loving toward her, was now distant. His late nights at work became more frequent, and his moods began to fluctuate. What Rachel didn't realize was that while she was busy with her own work, Emily and Mark were growing closer. The lines between employer and employee were blurring, and something far darker was beginning to take shape right under her nose. As weeks passed, the relationship between Mark and Emily deepened in ways Rachel could never have imagined. What began as friendly conversations about work or the children slowly turned into something much more intimate. Emily, for her part, seemed to enjoy the attention Mark was giving her. She had grown up in a small town and was still adjusting to life in the city, where she was far from her family and friends. Mark, a confident and successful man, offered her the kind of companionship and validation she had craved. They began spending more time together when Rachel wasn't around, at first just talking, but over time, their interactions grew more charged. The lines between casual friendship and something more blurred without either of them realizing how deep they were slipping. It wasn't long before Mark's intentions became clear. The late-night conversations and private moments in the kitchen, when Rachel was in the other room, were not just innocent exchanges. Mark had found himself drawn to Emily, captivated by her youth, energy, and the way she seemed to make him feel alive again. Their marriage, which had once been full of passion and understanding, had recently fallen into a routine that felt stale to him. Rachel had been busy with her teaching, career, and raising their 2 children, leaving Mark to feel more isolated and overlooked. Emily, on the other hand, was constantly available, eager to listen, and full of life. For Emily, the attention was intoxicating. She had grown fond of Mark, and despite knowing that he was married, she couldn't resist the growing chemistry between them. There was something about him, his confidence, his maturity, that made her feel special, something she hadn't experienced before. At first it felt like harmless flirtation, a fun escape from the pressures of her life. But before long, it was clear that both she and Mark were emotionally invested. They began sneaking glances at each other when Rachel wasn't around, touching each other casually but with intent. The attraction between them became undeniable, and what had started as an innocent bond quickly escalated into a full-blown affair. Emily tried to push aside the guilt that gnawed at her. She was fully aware of the betrayal she was engaging in, but the thrill of being wanted by a married man overshadowed any reservations she had. Mark, for his part, had become consumed by the affair. He was no longer the husband Rachel had known. When he came home, he would put on a mask of normalcy, pretending everything was fine but his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts were consumed by Emily, and he found himself planning ways to be with her without Rachel suspecting a thing. As the affair continued, so did the deception. Emily kept up the appearance of being the perfect, sweet babysitter. She was kind and loving toward the children, always putting on a happy face when Rachel was around. Mark, meanwhile, became more distant from Rachel, often citing work commitments or being too tired to engage in meaningful conversation. Despite the changes, Rachel, in her busy life, failed to notice the subtle shifts in their dynamic. She remained unaware that the woman she trusted with her children had now become a source of growing tension in her marriage. In the secret corners of their home, Mark and Emily were crafting a dangerous bond, one that would have consequences neither of them could foresee. What started as a fling, a way for both of them to escape their respective frustrations, was quickly spiraling out of control. Neither of them knew how to stop the momentum they had set in motion, and as time went on, it became clear that this affair would not end quietly. What was once a simple infidelity was quickly morphing into something much more dangerous, setting the stage for the unimaginable betrayal that would soon follow. As the affair between Mark and Emily continued, the tension in the Thompson household became palpable, though Rachel remained largely oblivious to it. Mark's behavior grew increasingly erratic, and while Rachel initially dismissed his distant attitude as a result of his work pressures, she began to notice small things that didn't quite add up. He was home less and less, constantly coming up with excuses for his absences. Late-night meetings, urgent phone calls, and a growing tendency to work weekends. These were all signs Rachel couldn't ignore any longer. Mark's interactions with her were more mechanical than before, and the warmth that had once characterized their relationship seemed to be fading away. He was no longer the attentive husband she had married. He was a stranger who walked through their home, consumed by something she couldn't yet understand. But what bothered Rachel most was how little Mark seemed to engage with the children. Ethan and Sophie had grown accustomed to his absence and didn't seem to question it. But Rachel couldn't help but feel a sense of emotional distance between Mark and his family. She had always known him to be a devoted father, yet now he seemed more interested in escaping his responsibilities than fulfilling them. Rachel tried to talk to him about her concerns, but Mark brushed her off, telling her that work was just stressful right now and that things would get better. He promised that he loved her and the kids, and that they just needed to ride out this difficult phase. Yet, despite his reassurances, Rachel couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. She started to question herself. Was it possible that she was overreacting? Maybe she was simply tired from work and the constant demands of raising two young children. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Every time Mark came home, he seemed more withdrawn, his eyes distant. He had always been charming and engaging, but now he appeared to be lost in his own world. One evening, as Rachel was tidying up the living room, she noticed something strange. Mark's phone, which he had carelessly left on the kitchen counter, buzzed with a new message. Rachel wasn't one to invade his privacy, but in that moment, something compelled her to glance at the screen. The message was from Emily. It was a simple "Good night, Mark," but the intimacy behind it was unmistakable. A cold shiver ran down Rachel's spine as she put the phone down quickly. She told herself it was nothing, that she was just being paranoid. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling of betrayal. Rachel didn't have concrete proof, but she could no longer deny that something had changed between her and Mark. She had always prided herself on being an intuitive person, able to read people's emotions, but the trust she had once placed in her husband now seemed misplaced. With every passing day, the weight of her suspicions grew heavier, and yet she found herself unable to confront him directly. There was a part of her that still wanted to believe that things could go back to normal, that the life they had built together was still intact. As Rachel tried to keep her family functioning, trying to shield the kids from whatever turmoil was brewing beneath the surface, Mark and Emily's relationship was continuing to evolve. The affair had started innocently enough, but now it had escalated beyond their control. Emily, too, was starting to realize the danger they were both in. But instead of backing away, she and Mark became further enmeshed in their secret. It was only a matter of time before the consequences of their actions would catch up with them. But for now, they continued their web of lies, each of them too deep in their own desires to acknowledge the destruction they were setting in motion. The slow unraveling of Mark and Rachel's marriage reached a breaking point that neither of them saw coming. Rachel's suspicions grew sharper with each passing day. She could no longer deny that something had changed in Mark. The affectionate gestures they once shared had become rare, and his attention seemed to drift elsewhere. There were nights when Rachel would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was imagining things, or if something truly was wrong. The strain between them was palpable, but Mark remained closed off, retreating into his own world. When Rachel asked him about his behavior, he would offer vague explanations about work pressures and stress, but his responses lacked the usual sincerity. He was pulling away from her, and she couldn't figure out why. What disturbed Rachel most was the sudden coldness that seemed to settle between them. Mark had always been affectionate, quick to comfort her when she had a bad day or to share a laugh when things got tough. But now, he was distant, his touch more mechanical, his words less meaningful. Even during family dinners, he would absent-mindedly check his phone, his mind clearly elsewhere. This wasn't the man she had married, the man who used to make her feel cherished and loved. Rachel could feel herself growing more isolated, unable to connect with the person who had once been her closest confidant. Despite all the signs pointing to a deepening disconnect, Rachel convinced herself that it was just a phase. She tried to distract herself by focusing more on her work, on the children, on the daily routine that had once brought comfort. But the more she tried to keep her life normal, the more she felt the weight of Mark's absence. She began to sense that something wasn't just wrong with their marriage, it was wrong with Mark himself. His moods fluctuated, sometimes sharp and irritable, other times withdrawn and distant. There was no pattern to it, no clear explanation, just a steady undercurrent of unease that Rachel couldn't ignore anymore. Then, Rachel made a discovery that would change everything. One afternoon, while picking up after the kids, she found a receipt hidden under the couch cushions. It was for a gift shop dated just a week before. At first, Rachel didn't think much of it, until she saw that the gift was something clearly intended for a woman. The receipt showed a necklace, a delicate piece of jewelry that wasn't something Rachel would ever buy for herself. Her heart sank as she realized that Mark had purchased this gift for someone else. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just his behavior that had been changing, it was his heart. He was no longer the man who shared everything with her. He had been hiding something, and now the evidence was in her hands. The discovery sent Rachel into a spiral of emotions. She felt betrayed, hurt, and confused. How could Mark, the man she had trusted with her life, be having an affair? How long had this been going on? Rachel was desperate for answers, but every time she tried to bring it up to him, Mark would deflect, claiming it was nothing, or that she was overthinking things. But in her gut, Rachel knew better. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Still, she hesitated to confront him directly. The idea of facing the reality of his betrayal, of the life she had built with him, was too overwhelming to process. Instead, she continued to try and hold things together, for the sake of their children, for the sake of their family, even though she felt her world slowly coming apart. Mark's affair, though hidden, had now cast a long shadow over their home, and while Rachel tried to put on a brave face, the mounting tension was becoming unbearable. What had started as a small crack in their relationship was now a deep chasm, one that neither of them could easily cross. The day Rachel Thompson's life would never be the same began like any other. The morning had been calm, with Rachel making breakfast for the kids while Mark got ready for work, his usual routine. Ethan and Sophie were playing in the living room, their laughter filling the house, and everything seemed, on the surface, normal. But by evening, the peace that had defined their home would be shattered forever. Rachel was excited about the evening plans she had made with Mark, an intimate dinner for two, away from the distractions of work and the children. She had hoped it would help them reconnect, to bridge the growing emotional gap between them. She had been trying to keep up appearances, to push through the discomfort in her marriage, but deep down, she knew that their relationship was deteriorating. Still, she clung to the hope that if they spent some quality time together, it might reset things, that maybe they could find their way back to each other. But when Rachel returned home that afternoon after a trip to the grocery store, she immediately sensed that something was off. Mark's car was in the driveway, but he was nowhere to be found inside. At first, she thought he was simply in the backyard or taking a call. However, when she noticed his keys on the counter, a strange unease washed over her. She called out for him, but there was no answer. A feeling of dread crept over her as she searched the house, her heart beating faster with each room she checked. The children were upstairs playing quietly, oblivious to the growing tension in the air. But Rachel's eyes fell on something that made her stomach drop, an open bottle of wine, 2 glasses, and the faint scent of perfume in the air. It was clear that Mark had not been alone. Rachel's mind raced, her breath coming in short bursts as she pieced together the clues. Emily, the babysitter, the lingering scent of perfume confirmed Rachel's darkest fears. Without thinking, she rushed to the master bedroom, her mind in a fog. What she saw when she opened the door left her breathless. The room was a mess, as if someone had been in a hurry. But what caught her attention immediately was the sight of Mark's phone, lying on the bed with a new message notification from Emily. Rachel's hands trembled as she picked it up and read the text. It was a simple, "Can't wait to see you tonight." Her hands shook violently as her worst suspicions were confirmed. The affair was real. Emily wasn't just the babysitter. She was the woman who had been slowly destroying everything Rachel had worked so hard to build. Rachel's mind raced, and before she could fully process the shock, her phone rang. It was the police. At first, she thought it might be a wrong number or a call about a neighbor's issue. But when the voice on the other end identified themselves as responding to an emergency at her home, Rachel's heart sank. They found Rachel. The officer's voice was cold, robotic, but the words pierced through her like a blade. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she frantically asked for details. The officer explained that they had received a 911 call, and when they arrived, they found Rachel's body in her bedroom, strangled, a violent and deliberate act. Rachel's mind went blank. She couldn't process the words. Her life, which had once seemed so solid, had been destroyed in an instant. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was murder. Rachel had been taken from her children and husband in the most horrific way. The very foundation of her family was shattered, and in the wake of it all, a chilling question remained. Who could have done such a thing? As Rachel's world crumbled, so too did the carefully constructed lies. The affair, which had begun as a quiet deception, had now evolved into a deadly consequence. And as the investigation unfolded, the police would uncover truths more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. What had started as an emotional betrayal was now a crime of passion, one that would forever alter the course of the Thompson family's life. The discovery of Rachel's body sent shockwaves through the entire community. The quiet, picturesque suburb where the Thompsons had lived for years was no longer a place of safety. It was a crime scene. Neighbors, once familiar with the smiling faces of Mark and Rachel, were left in disbelief as news of her murder spread. Rachel's tragic death, in a house that had once felt so secure, shattered the calm of their neighborhood. The police quickly launched an investigation, but they were faced with few answers. Rachel had no known enemies, and there were no signs of forced entry into the house. It didn't appear to be a robbery gone wrong. Instead, the crime felt personal, intimate. Whoever had killed Rachel had been close to her, someone who knew her, who had access to her home. As detectives combed through the evidence, they began to focus on those closest to her, Mark and Emily. Mark's first reaction to the news was one of utter shock and grief. He appeared devastated when he arrived at the scene, his face pale, his voice trembling. He told police that he had been at work all day, trying to close a deal. He couldn't understand how someone could have taken Rachel's life in such a brutal manner. He was quick to offer his cooperation with the authorities, and for a while, he seemed to be the grieving husband, overwhelmed by the tragedy. However, there was something about Mark's behavior that seemed off to the investigators. His answers to their questions were inconsistent, and there was a strange sense of detachment in his responses. He appeared more focused on the logistics of the investigation rather than on his wife's death. When detectives began asking about his whereabouts in the hours leading up to the murder, Mark's story began to shift. At first, he had claimed to have been at the office all day, but when police checked with his colleagues, they found that he had left earlier than he had said. Just as the case seemed to be nearing its conclusion with Emily's involvement, an unexpected twist in the investigation caused everything to unravel in a way that no one had anticipated. As the detectives dug deeper into the events surrounding Rachel's murder, they uncovered a series of details that had been overlooked during the initial investigation, details that would point them in a direction they hadn't even considered before. It all started with a second, more thorough examination of Mark's behavior. While Emily's confession was initially seen as the breakthrough that would close the case, something about Mark's increasingly erratic behavior and shifting accounts didn't sit right with the detectives. His emotional response to Rachel's death was beginning to look more like a performance than genuine grief. His insistence on cooperating with the investigation was almost too eager, too polished, as if he were trying too hard to appear innocent. One evening, as part of their routine re-interviewing process, the detectives decided to bring Mark in for further questioning. This time, they would focus on the inconsistencies in his statements, specifically regarding his whereabouts during the time of Rachel's murder. The timeline that Mark had provided was still vague, and the investigators had found evidence suggesting that he had been more involved in the moments leading up to Rachel's death than he had admitted. As the hours passed in the interrogation room, Mark's calm exterior began to crack. He stumbled over his words and became visibly agitated when the detectives confronted him with evidence that didn't align with his previous accounts. But the breakthrough came when the detectives asked about his relationship with Emily in more detail. For the first time, Mark seemed to hesitate. He seemed to struggle with his response, caught off guard by their line of questioning. It was then that Mark's story took a shocking turn. He admitted that while he had been having an affair with Emily, it wasn't her alone who had been involved in the plot to murder Rachel. Mark revealed a secret that he had kept hidden from everyone. He had played a central role in orchestrating Rachel's death. Emily's jealousy and emotional outbursts had been a catalyst, but it was Mark who had set the wheels in motion, manipulating the situation in such a way that Rachel would ultimately become a casualty of his own desires. The detectives were stunned by this revelation. Mark had been playing a dangerous game, using his affair with Emily as a shield to hide his own role in the murder. In a series of private conversations with Emily, he had expressed frustration over his failing marriage and his growing desire to be free from Rachel. Emily, already consumed by her feelings for Mark, had eagerly agreed to help him. But what neither of them expected was how quickly things would spiral out of control. Mark confessed that he had planted the idea in Emily's mind that Rachel was the obstacle standing in the way of their happiness. He had preyed on Emily's insecurities and jealousy, telling her that Rachel was growing suspicious of their relationship and that their secret was at risk of being exposed. The final push came when Mark suggested to Emily that if Rachel was out of the picture, they could finally be together, free from the constraints of their lies. Emily had reluctantly agreed, but it was clear from Mark's admission that he had been the one to orchestrate the murder, using Emily as his pawn. The detectives couldn't believe what they were hearing. Mark's admission turned everything upside down. What they had thought was a passionate crime of jealousy now seemed like a calculated, cold-blooded murder, one driven by a desperate man who would do anything to escape the life he had built with Rachel. Emily, initially portrayed as the sole instigator, was now revealed as a manipulated accomplice who had been led down a dark path by the man she had trusted. Mark's confession shattered the illusions of those who had believed him to be the grief-stricken husband. He had been playing a dangerous game all along, and now, with the truth coming to light, he would face the consequences of his actions. As the details of the plot unfolded, the detectives realized that Rachel's murder wasn't just the result of a love triangle. It was a tragic tale of manipulation, betrayal, and a man's greed for freedom, a story that would haunt everyone who had known the Thompsons. The case, once thought to be solved, had only just begun to reveal its darkest secrets. As the investigation finally reached its conclusion, the shockwaves of Rachel Thompson's murder continued to ripple through the community. The small town, once a peaceful and familiar place, now stood as a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most seemingly perfect lives. The revelations surrounding Rachel's death were far more complex than anyone had ever imagined, and the aftermath left everyone questioning the true nature of trust and betrayal. Mark's confession brought the case to a close, but it also opened up a deeper, more unsettling chapter. Though he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, it was the emotional toll of his actions that left the most lasting impact. Mark had spent years cultivating an image of a devoted husband and loving father, but his role in his wife's brutal murder had shattered that facade. The man who had once been seen as an upstanding member of the community was now exposed for who he truly was: selfish, manipulative, and capable of the most unspeakable betrayal. He had not only killed his wife, but he had destroyed the lives of his children, who would now grow up without the love and stability they had once known. Emily, too, faced the consequences of her involvement. Though she had acted out of emotional manipulation and a misguided sense of love for Mark, her role in the crime could not be overlooked. She had become an unwitting accomplice in a plan she didn't fully understand, yet she was still held accountable for her actions. Emily pled guilty to manslaughter, and while her sentence was less severe than Mark's, it didn't absolve her of the destruction she had caused. The woman who had once been a trusted figure in Rachel's life would never be able to erase the weight of her choices. She was now left to grapple with the consequences of the obsession that had clouded her judgment and led her down a dark path. As the trial concluded, and Mark was sentenced to life in prison, the town slowly began to heal, though the scars would remain for years to come. The tragedy of Rachel's death had exposed the fragile nature of trust, the darkness that can grow from the seeds of jealousy and manipulation, and the devastating effects of infidelity and deceit. What had appeared to be a simple affair between a babysitter and her employer had turned into a tale of betrayal, murder, and the unraveling of a once ideal family. For the children of Mark and Rachel, the future seemed uncertain. They were left with the haunting knowledge that their father had played a central role in their mother's death, and they would have to live with the legacy of his actions. Though family members stepped in to care for them, the damage had already been done. The emotional scars left on Ethan and Sophie would likely last a lifetime, and the sense of betrayal they would feel from their father's actions would shape their lives in ways that no one could predict. As the community moved forward, the story of Rachel Thompson's tragic death became a cautionary tale, one that served as a painful reminder of how quickly a life can be torn apart by betrayal. People whispered about the affair between the babysitter and the husband, but what they didn't always speak about were the deeper, more insidious forces that had driven those involved to commit such a horrific act. It was a story of lies, of manipulation, of how people can become entangled in their own desires and obsessions, and how in the end, those dark impulses can lead to irreversible tragedy. Though Rachel's death could never be undone, her story served as a sobering reminder that the truth will always come to light, even in the darkest corners of a seemingly perfect life. The affair between the babysitter and the husband had ended in shocking murder, but it had also led to a final reckoning for all those involved. The community, forever changed by the events, would never be the same.